In this video I'll be talking about my sharpening process. It's been 3 years since I last did a video about this, and a few things have changed since then with the tools that I use and the methods that I use too. So let's get started. First I'll talk about the equipment that I use. This 360 and 600 grit double-sided diamond plate, I've been using this for years now and it still works okay, but it doesn't cut as quickly as it once did. It was cheap when I bought it, about £15 or $18 at the time, but since then the price has doubled and now it's about £40 or $50. I think it was good value at £15, but £40 I'm not so sure. I might look at upgrading it someday, but for now it's fine. The second thing I use is this King Japanese double-sided 1000 and 6000 grit whetstone. This is about £40 at the moment, which is $50, and I really like it, mainly because it cuts really quickly. This I would say is well worth the money. As long as you take care of it and keep the faces nice and flat, it's absolutely brilliant. Now the thing that I like about having this combination of a more coarse grit diamond plate along with a finer grit whetstone is that I can use the diamond plate to flatten the whetstone, and that takes virtually no time at all. I'll show you later in the video. The third thing I use is my leather strop. I have a video about how I make these. I also have some for sale via my Etsy store if you're interested in buying one. Mine was made from a scrap block of MDF and some leather salvaged from an old sofa, so it didn't cost anything. Back when I made this one I was using super glue to mount the leather to the MDF, and that hasn't always been successful. The ones I have for sale on my Etsy store are made using spray contact adhesive, which works much better. I charged the leather strop with some green buffing or polishing compound. This is cheap to buy, and if you get a big block like this, it'll last a very long time. This one might even last me a lifetime, I should imagine. I've probably used about maybe 5% of it in about 4 years. In addition to those things, I also sometimes use a honing guide, just a really cheap one. Cost of that is under £10 or $12. I say sometimes because I've recently been trying to perfect the art of hand sharpening, and I'm getting there, but I'm not quite there yet. I'll leave links in the description box below to the stuff I use if you want to check out any of it. So all this stuff here is what I use for my best chisels, which are these ones here, and my Handplane blades. My main chisels are pretty inexpensive too, but they've served me well. I'll leave a link to these down below too. I also have a few old second-hand ones picked up from car boot sales over the years for anything between 50p to a couple of pounds. And my hand planes are all either Stanley or Record Bailey style planes with the original plane irons. Again, nothing special, available second-hand for very little money, but tools that perform brilliantly and will probably outlast me. I also have some really cheap and nasty chisels which just get abused. I'll use these if, for example, I'm chiseling a piece of wood that has a nail in it. And the method I use for sharpening these is much more barbaric, quick and dirty. I basically just want to get a sharp edge very quickly with no concern about precision. I'll show that method later in the video too. The main point I'm trying to make here is that you don't need to spend silly money on fancy chisels, hand planes and sharpening equipment to get a set of great tools that perform really well. If you do spend more money on chisels though, they're probably going to be made of better quality steel, which means that they will stay sharper for longer, meaning less time spent sharpening and more time spent using the tools. It's also possible that it'll be easier and take less time to flatten the backs of the better quality chisels too. Some of the cheaper ones need a lot of work to get them flat. My set took a bit of work to get flat, but they weren't too bad. If you want a recommendation from me for a set of chisels that are better quality than the ones which I use but aren't crazy expensive, I've heard really good things about the set by Narex, which I'll link to below. I haven't used them, but they have an excellent reputation in terms of being really good quality tool steel, good value for money, and they would be the ones that I would buy if I were to look at upgrading at any point. In terms of hand planes, I can't recommend anything other than the Bailey style planes that I use, mainly because they're the only ones I've ever used. Nowadays there are fancy low angle planes available, but I've personally never felt the need to use anything other than the Bailey style planes. They're inexpensive, expect to pay £20 to £30 for something like this Stanley No. 4 on eBay or Facebook Marketplace. They're often priced even less than that at a car boot sale, for example, and those prices make these a real bargain when you consider that these are tools that should last forever if well looked after, and they perform brilliantly once you set them up. I have a video all about how to set up a hand plane like this, and I'll link to that in the description box below too. Process. For my best chisels and cutting irons, it's actually not all that often that I reach for all of this sharpening equipment, and that's because once the back faces and cutting edge are in good order, free of dings and damage and nicely sharpened, all I need to do to keep them cutting well is to use my leather strop just to hone the edge, and that keeps it cutting nicely. I just do a few swipes to the bevel, maybe 20 or so, and then it's back to work. There are only a few situations when I will reach for the diamond plates and whetstone, and those reasons are: one, if it hasn't been sharpened properly in months and honing on the leather strop just isn't doing enough to keep the edge sharp anymore; two, if the cutting edge has any dings or damage; and three, if it's a chisel that I've just bought, either new or second hand, and I want to make sure that it's tuned up to my standards. But a chisel that's new to me, the first thing that I'll do is spend some time flattening the back of the chisel, and I'll start with the 360 grit side of my diamond plate, spray on a little water and rub it backwards and forwards. The water just helps remove any of the metal particles so that they don't get stuck to the surface. If you don't have a diamond plate, you can easily use wet and dry abrasive paper for this, and that's what I used to do before getting the diamond plate. It's easy to see where material is being removed by the sharpening, and if you want to make it even more obvious, you can use a marker pen to draw lines and then look at where they are disappearing after sharpening. For the work that I do, I'm not concerned about getting the whole back of the chisel or cutting iron perfectly flat. I just want the very tip to be flat, so if I've got, say, 5mm at the end, nice and flat, that's enough for me. I then move on to the 600 grit side and follow the same process again. Then it's on to using the whetstone, which I try to soak in a container of water for maybe 10 minutes or so before using it. And I do the same again on the 1000 grit side, followed by the 6000 grit side. To keep the faces of the whetstone nice and flat, as I mentioned earlier, I can just use the diamond plate, which is really quick and easy to do, and then it's good to go again. Then I move on to the leather strop, charging it up with some green polishing compound and pulling it back towards me rather than moving backwards and forwards, because I don't want to round over the cutting edge. And by this point I'll have a reflective mirror-like finish. Next I turn my attention to the bevel, and for that I'm going to use this honing guide, which again I'll link to in the description box below, and a handmade jig which allows me to set things up quickly, accurately and repeatably at the angle that I want. This is just a piece of plywood with some blocks glued on. On the left are the settings for the chisels and on the right for the handplane irons. And I've written the distances on this jig in case you want to have a go at making one of these for yourself. For the main bevel I use a 25-degree angle, and on the very tip a steeper 30-degree angle, which is known as a micro bevel. And that just helps to concentrate all of your sharpening energy onto the very part that's going to be doing the cutting. Plus that steeper angle will help with edge retention too. I can butt the honing guide right up to the edge of the jig and secure either the chisel or cutting iron in place, and I know that the angle is going to be correct each and every time. It's always worth checking that it's fitted square to the honing guide too. The honing guide has a roller on the bottom, and I can set that onto the 360 grit side of the diamond plate and start sharpening until I can see a little wire burr along the full length of the cutting edge. You can either look for it or feel for it, and as soon as I have that, I'm ready to move on to the 600 grit side of the diamond plate. Then onto the 1000 side of the whetstone, and then the 6000 side. At this point I'll remove the honing guide and do some stropping by hand, first finding the bevel angle, then lifting it up a fraction to make sure that all of that effort is concentrated on the very tip, and pulling back multiple times to polish up the cutting edge. It's also worth honing the back edge again to remove any trace of that burr in case it's still there. By this point I have a really nice sharp cutting edge ready for work. I definitely recommend getting the honing guide, especially if you're new to sharpening, but recently I've been doing it all by hand just because it speeds things up, not having to mess around with setting up the jig each time. But there is a bit of a technique and skill needed. I'm not brilliant at it yet, but I am getting there. For this, I find the bevel angle and then just kind of try to lock my lower arms in at that angle to keep it consistent. I also only pull backwards rather than backwards and forwards to avoid the risk of damaging the cutting edge. I thoroughly dry off both my diamond plate and whetstone after use. Now to talk about my crude method for sharpening. My cheap chisels that don't get used very often, but when they do get used, they get to go to the nasty, dirty places that my best chisels would never go. These are not used for fine joinery or anything like that, but it is useful to get them sharp every so often, and as I'm not concerned with getting them prepared for accurate work, I go straight to my bench grinder sander. I bought a 400 grit belt and I can simply hold it roughly at the right angle to clean up the bevel just by eye, and then a few swipes on a leather strop and that's it, they're nice and sharp. While I wouldn't recommend this method for good quality chisels, it works well enough for the kind of rough work that I use these chisels for. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe to my channel for more weekly woodworking videos. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can do that via PayPal or Patreon, links below in the description box. On Patreon you can also get early access to my videos, some exclusive content, free project plans and cut lists, and a name credit at the end of my videos. Thank you for watching.